You wake up to the sound of crying, but it's not a newborn's whimper. It's a collective, gut-deep wailing, raw as torn flesh. The sun hasn't even cracked the horizon, and already mothers are outside, gripping tiny skulls between wooden boards, like they're trying to squeeze eternity into a forehead. Welcome to dawn in a Hunnic camp. The birds don't sing here, they don't dare. We romanticize nomads, the freedom, the horses, the endless steppes stretching like a dream. But Hunnic life wasn't some windswept poem. It was survival sharpened to a blade, and from the moment you were born, your skull was proof. If you think beauty hurts now, try having your cranium restructured before you've even learned to blink properly. These weren't random acts of cruelty. No, they were love, warped by necessity and legacy. Hunnic mothers believed a flat, elongated head was the pinnacle of strength and nobility. Round heads were for peasants, for prey. The warrior elite had sloped brows and tapered skulls like arrows fired from divine bows. To ensure their babies matched the look, mothers acted early. Within days of birth, the skull was still soft, still mouldable like warm wax, and so they shaped it, not with tenderness, with pressure. You're watching Hushed Historian, where truth whispers through time. If you enjoy what I dig up for you, subscribe so we don't lose our little historical connection. Thank you. The tools were deceptively simple. 2 carved wooden boards, some padded cloth, and strips of sinew or leather to bind the whole thing tightly. The infant's head was laid between the planks and secured, sometimes for months. Every few days the wrappings would be checked, adjusted, retightened. Mothers did this with the same rhythmic diligence they applied to cooking, stitching, or sharpening knives. Except instead of preparing dinner, they were preparing destiny. The pressure didn't just flatten the skull, it trained the mind to belong. If you didn't have the look, you didn't belong. But that wasn't even the worst part. This wasn't done behind closed doors. There were no nurseries, no soft lullabies, no privacy. This ritual happened outside, under the eye of the rising sun. Every morning, mothers emerged from their felt tents like high priestesses of pain, gripping their infants and wooden boards, performing the ancient rite with mechanical precision. The air was thick with dew and baby screams. You could hear it from one end of the camp to the other, a chorus of infant agony wrapped in maternal devotion. The neighbours didn't flinch. This was normal, expected, celebrated. The louder the baby cried, the more alive it was. The tighter the boards, the better the mother. Blood sometimes crusted in the baby's hairline. Small scabs formed where the straps dug in. And still, the ritual continued, because pain in Hunnic logic meant strength was being forged. Now imagine you're a child, born into that world, before your first word, before your first step, before even the concept of self. Your body is already being shaped into a symbol, not for who you are, but who your people expect you to be. Warrior, rider, predator. Huns didn't wait for puberty to teach discipline. They started with the skull, and the irony? They believed it made their children beautiful. That elongated cranium wasn't just a badge of status, it was seductive. Hunnic men with high, sloped foreheads were seen as God-touched, like they carried the sky in their bones. Women, too, were expected to adopt the shape. Even if they never rode into battle, their skulls bore the same marks. Beauty and brutality weren't opposites here. They were twins. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, those babies who didn't survive the process, they were mourned, but not with guilt. Their mothers wept, yes, but not because they questioned the ritual. They wept because their child had failed to endure it. In their minds, the skull pressing didn't kill the baby, weakness did. And weakness, in the Hunnic worldview, was more dangerous than disease, more offensive than betrayal. Weakness was a curse. Strength, even in the form of mutilation, was sacred. By the time most Hunnic children could walk, their heads had already been shaped like ceremonial helmets. Their faces bore the imprint of 1,000 dawns spent screaming into the wind. And their mothers, they watched with pride, because to them, Every ridge, every slope, every distorted angle was proof that they had done their job. They had crafted a warrior. That was the mantra, not born crafted, like leather stretched over bone, like iron bent into blade. Hunnic society didn't wait for nature to deliver the ideal. Mothers took fate by the throat before the sun even cleared the sky. And if you think that kind of parenting ended with head shaping, then you severely underestimate how far a culture built on conquest and survival was willing to go. By the time a Hunnic child was old enough to stand, they were already enrolled in what can only be described as a living boot camp. Toys, forget it. Childhood was not a protected chapter. It was an audition for life or death. Boys were given miniature bows almost as soon as they could hold them. Their fingers bled before they could even pronounce their own names. Arrows weren't toys, they were introductions to the only skill that mattered, killing at a distance with terrifying precision. And the girls, they weren't pampered either. Sure, some would grow into roles more domestic, but that didn't mean softness. They learned to butcher animals, tan hides, brew fermented mare's milk until it was sour enough to peel paint off a yurt wall. Discipline came from mothers as sharp as any blade. A girl who dropped a knife could expect her fingers wrapped. A girl who flinched at blood. Shame. Everything was training. Everything was preparation. And it all began with that warped little skull, baked into identity like a brand. But something darker was coming. As the children aged, their deformities became declarations. Walking through camp, you could tell who had suffered properly just by the silhouette of their heads. Rounded skulls, those were either outsiders or orphans, children who hadn't been loved enough. It wasn't said aloud, but it was understood. A flat head meant pride, a round one meant pity, or worse, disdain. If a baby survived, but its skull hadn't been shaped, it might still grow strong. But it would never be chosen. Never lead. It would forever bear the mark of imperfection. And here's where it gets even more twisted. Some skulls were shaped not just for aesthetic, but symbolic reasons. A steeper incline was believed to foster keener instincts. A broader back meant better vision, quicker reactions. These were superstitions passed down like heirlooms. Mothers whispered them between feedings, between stitches, between quiet prayers, to whatever gods they half feared and half mocked. It wasn't just beauty, it was biology, magic, destiny, all compressed into a child's bleeding scalp at sunrise. Now imagine the psychological stew boiling beneath all this. A child raised to believe that every ounce of love they received depended on how painful their infancy had been. Affection equaled agony. Status came from suffering. You weren't worthy unless someone had reshaped you into it. Literally. And that belief didn't just shape the skull, it shaped the soul. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear the ritual didn't end when the boards came off. Oh no, that was just phase one. Once the skull had been properly moulded and the child deemed fit, there came the second sunrise, this one even more symbolic and just as brutal. It was called the Reckoning of Dawn. No joke. On a child's first successful removal day, the entire family gathered outside before light, doused the infant in cold water and held it toward the rising sun, not to pray, but to scream. Because if the child didn't scream loud enough, it was believed the gods had taken something from it, its spirit, its strength, its will. That scream wasn't just noise, it was proof of soul, of readiness, of future fury. And if the scream was weak, the child was considered delayed by shadow, a euphemism for being cursed or doomed to be lesser. Some were quietly smothered, others were raised as servants, forbidden to ride or carry arms. Imagine that. One cry too soft, and your life path was diverted forever. The Reckoning of Dawn wasn't recorded in Roman accounts, but oral histories, passed down like dark lullabies, speak of it with both reverence and dread. It was the moment your skull stopped being shaped, and your future began being judged, and the mothers, they never cried during it. They only watched, faces hard as hoarfrost, waiting to see if their pain had been worth it. That moment, the scream or silence, sealed a child's future more effectively than any crown or scar. The camp didn't applaud, didn't cheer, it listened, like wolves around a newborn howl, because in the Hunnic world, if your voice couldn't command the sky, it meant you'd never command men. And just like that, you were sorted, not by caste or coin or merit, but by scream. A society built on conquest couldn't afford weak links. Everything, from milk teeth to battle cries, was an audition for the front line. But what if you passed? What if you screamed loud enough to echo across tents and through the ribs of sleeping horses? Then your training began, and it made the skullboards look like lullabies. Boys were pulled from their mother's arms by age 5. No gentle transitions, no long farewells. Fathers, or more often uncles, because Hunnic paternity was a complicated guess at best, dragged them to the men's quarters. Think daycare, but with whips, flint knives, and target practice using live animals. Failure wasn't corrected with encouragement. It was punished with fire. And the girls? The lucky ones learned how to ride before they bled. They weren't sheltered from violence. They were braided into it. Hair bound tight, dresses cinched for speed, knuckles hardened from pounding grain, then skin. Because in times of war, even the women rode. Even the women bled for the cause. A girl who cried too much over a cut was laughed at. A girl who retaliated, she got extra stew that night. Let's go back a bit. To the mothers, the architects of all this. They weren't victims. They weren't reluctant participants. They were the engineers of Hunnic endurance. They carried generations of tradition, like invisible armour. They were respected, feared, obeyed. And yes, they were brutal, but they were brutal because they had to be. The world didn't offer second chances to those who cradled weakness. One elder woman, remembered in fragments of tribal stories, was known as the one who screamed louder than her son. Not out of pain, out of pride. When her infant wailed so fiercely during skull shaping that blood streamed from his ears, she didn't panic. She sang, loudly, over him, daring the gods to challenge her craftsmanship. That son grew into a warlord, or so the tale goes, killed 20 men before he turned 20. And when he died, she wore his bones around her neck like beads. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, mothers who lost babies during shaping weren't ostracised. They were elevated, martyrs of the tribe. Their tents were painted with red ochre, their names whispered with reverence. She tried, the elders would say. She offered him to the flame of war, and the flame took him early. These women were believed to be blessed, touched by the spirits of battle. Other mothers brought them offerings, scraps of fabric or bits of bread, hoping some of that tragic power would pass to their own children. There were even songs, sharp, percussive chants sung at dawn, celebrating the skull shapers, verses about hands strong enough to twist fate, melodies about babies born soft but hardened by mother's love and sacred wood. The lullabies of the Huns didn't promise safety. They promised transformation. They promised purpose. No one slept peacefully to those tunes. They were warnings, wrapped in rhythm. And let's not forget the scars. Not all skulls took the shaping cleanly. Some grew jagged, some developed bulges or ridges or soft spots that never quite closed. But these too were marks of honour. Imperfect war shaping was still war shaping. Mothers would trace the ridges on their children's heads, like maps, like prophecies. Some believed certain contours foretold leadership. Others predicted death. Either way, the skull became a scripture only the mother could read. And by the time those children reached 10, they weren't just survivors, they were proof. Proof that the system worked, that the pain meant something, that the violence had a purpose. Every shaped skull was a trophy, not of war, but of endurance. And by 10 years old, most Hunnic children had already seen more blood than most Roman soldiers saw in a campaign. Not by accident, by design. It wasn't enough to survive shaping. You had to earn your place every single day after. The camps ran like a machine, and every child was a moving gear. Wake before dawn. Not for meditation or prayers, for drills, for bone-cracking repetition. Ride without reins, hunt without mercy, bleed without sound. because crying was for babies and your crying had already been spent in the cradle, crushed into wood. At 12, you were expected to kill something larger than a rabbit. If you failed, you were shamed. Not behind closed doors, but in front of the tribe. They didn't believe in second chances. You got one arrow, one shot, one crack of the wrist, and if it missed, you weren't fed that night. Failure wasn't just embarrassing, it was starvation. Literal, spiritual, reputational. The adults didn't explain this to children gently. They didn't explain it at all. Hunnic kids learned by watching. Watching their peers succeed or disappear. If a child faltered too often, they'd be quietly reassigned to camp work. No more weapons, no more horses, just scraping hides, boiling fat, collecting dung. The unspoken message, you're not one of us, not anymore. But something darker was coming. The camps were mobile, shifting like mirages across the steppe, but the rituals never changed. In every new location, before tents were even raised, a sacred circle was carved into the ground. This was where trials happened. Not court trials, blood trials. Young warriors would spar here while elders watched. Not refereed. Watched. Sometimes one of the combatants wouldn't get up. That wasn't considered a failure of mentorship. It was considered natural selection. Some mothers were banned from watching, not by rule, but by choice. They'd stand at the edge of camp, faces unreadable, staring toward the sacred circle, like it owed them something. And it did. Their children's futures were being fought for, literally, in dirt and blood. If your son walked out upright, with bruises and blood still steaming off his face, he might be offered a place in the guard. If he limped, he went back to drills. If he didn't walk out at all, the tribe didn't mourn. It adjusted, and still, the mothers shaped the next ones. As if each failure only deepened their conviction. As if losing one son just meant the next would scream louder, fight harder, die less. Hunnic love was never gentle, but it was relentless, immovable, terrifying. Some children begged for the boards back. No, really. Not because they liked the pain, but because the boards were simple. Binary wooden. You either endured or you didn't. But life after shaping was messier. Expectations clawed at every breath. And the pressure? Oh, it never left. It just moved inward, from skull to soul. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. There were children whose heads were shaped not just by family, but by politics. Hostages from allied clans were taken in, adopted into the tribe, and reshaped, literally and figuratively, to erase their past. These children had their skulls remoulded even later, sometimes at 3 or 4 years old, long after the ideal soft window had passed. The process was worse then, more painful, more dangerous. The survival rate plummeted, but when it worked, the results were undeniable. A reshaped child was a reprogrammed one. And here's the sick twist. Some of them were grateful, because their new skulls meant new status. They were no longer outsiders. They could rise, they could be chosen. All it took was losing the shape of their birth. And for every one of these reshaped survivors, there was a mother who wasn't really their mother, just a woman assigned to the task. These foster mothers didn't sing. They didn't whisper stories. They strapped the boards on tighter than blood mothers ever did. Because to them, these weren't children. They were experiments, statements, weapons waiting to be proven. And once they were deemed successful, once their screams were loud enough, their skulls angular enough, their obedience unwavering, they weren't celebrated. They were deployed. Childhood didn't end for the Huns. It was skipped entirely. If your bones could hold a blade, you were old enough to carry one. If your horse didn't buck you off, you were ready to ride into someone else's death. By 13, many Hunnic boys had already tasted their first kill. Not from afar, not with dignity, but up close. Throat slit, eyes open, they were taught to stare into the dying faces, to recognise the look, to see what they would one day wear themselves. These weren't sociopaths in training. These were children told, from the moment their heads were bound, that empathy was dangerous. That hesitation got people killed. That kindness was the seed of defeat. Girls weren't spared either. By puberty, they were expected to master duality. healers who could stitch wounds and gouge eyes, lovers who could ride bareback and throw javelins, mothers who, one day, would tie their own children into the same wooden skull frames and smile through the screaming. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was inheritance, and just when it couldn't get more absurd. The skull itself became currency. In diplomatic meetings with rival tribes or foreign envoys, Hunnic leaders often removed their helmets, slowly, ceremoniously, to reveal their shaped skulls. It wasn't vanity, it was warning. A silent declaration. We were made in pain. What makes you think we'll hesitate to return there? And it worked. Roman historians wrote about their unease when facing Huns, not just because of their tactics, but their faces. The elongated heads, the slanted eyes, the emotionless precision of a people born under pressure and raised without apology. Inside the camps, skulls took on religious value. Elder skulls, particularly of great warriors, were cleaned, polished, sometimes gilded in bronze and turned into drinking vessels. No, really, their shape, the very thing forged in infancy, was now a relic. Drink from it, and you were drinking legacy. Those vessels weren't morbid trophies, they were affirmations of philosophy. Life begins in pain, and it ends in purpose. Let's go back a bit. To the day of second birth. That's what they called the final day of shaping. The day the boards came off forever. Not every child made it that far, but those who did were given a ritual bath, not in water, in smoke. Dung and herbs were burned together in low ceramic bowls, filling the tent with a stench that clawed at your throat. The child stood naked in the fumes, eyes watering, lungs fighting, and if they didn't choke, if they stood tall through the haze, they were handed a talisman, a bone shard from a horse's leg, carved with the symbol of endurance, not worn. Swallowed, that's right, swallowed. The belief was that by consuming the token, the child internalized the spirit of the horse, its speed, its power, its endurance. Some choked, some vomited, some died, but the ones who kept it down were celebrated, not with hugs, with silence, a quiet nod from the mother. Approval wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. Their entire life had been screaming. Silence was the reward. But that wasn't even the worst part. Once the skull was shaped and the rituals complete, you didn't get to forget it. You were inspected regularly by elders who traced your head with calloused fingers, checking for integrity, for uniformity, for meaning. They'd discuss your contours like others might read palms or tea leaves. This one will be fast. This one is born for leadership. This one won't live past 20. And the child stood still, absorbing prophecies spoken not in mystic trance, but in maternal scars, in ancestral superstition, in cultural madness. And even as they grew, even as they killed, those warriors never forgot the dawns. The screaming, the boards, the mothers outside in the cold, hands stained with blood and milk, and hope twisted into wood, because beneath the helmets, behind the brutality, was always that shaped skull. Proof that pain wasn't just endured. It was engineered, curated, polished into a permanent identity. And the shaped skulls, they weren't scars, they were announcements. To the Huns, a child who hadn't screamed at dawn wasn't really alive. A man whose forehead was smooth and round was unfinished, like a blade left unsharpened. And for those unlucky enough to be captured by Huns, merchants, spies, Roman scouts, this deformity, this improvement, was the first thing they noticed before their bones met the dust. Foreigners couldn't understand it. Roman chroniclers described the Huns with phrases like hideous, beastly, and not quite human. Some even claimed the Huns were born deformed, that they were naturally monstrous. But that wasn't ignorance, that was fear, deep, sweaty-palmed fear, because nothing terrifies an empire more than a people who choose pain, who manufacture it, who wear it like armour. The Romans assumed it was barbarism, but no barbarian ever moved with such calculated purpose. By the 5th century, when Attila began sweeping across Europe like a storm of knives, the shaped skull had already become a legend. Warriors with heads like battering rams, cold eyes and no hesitation. They rode horses as if born on the saddle, communicated with animalistic grunts and subtle nods. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Their skulls had already spoken, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, Hunnic mothers began exporting the practice. Not officially, not like traders selling silks or spices, but through marriage. Allied tribes, terrified of falling behind, began adopting the ritual. Elites from the Ostrogoths, Alans, and even some Slavic tribes started shaping their own children's skulls. Not because they believed in the spirits, but because they believed in power. It became a trend, a grotesque prestige. Look, they were saying without words, we are close to the Huns, we share their pain, we deserve their mercy. Of course it backfired. Imitation wasn't respect in Hunnic eyes, it was theft, and nothing enraged a Hun more than a thief pretending to be family. Whole settlements were razed for copying the shape without earning the scream. To mimic the skull without enduring the dawn was considered blasphemy, a lie carved into bone. Let's go back a bit. To the infants, to the ones who didn't make it. Not every child's head could handle the pressure. Some skulls caved, bled internally, swelled unnaturally. These babies didn't just die, they rotted in their mother's arms, while the rest of the camp carried on. There was no morgue, no ritualized grief. If the child died during shaping, it was said the gods had rejected it. The corpse was burned with dry horse dung before sunset. The mother slept on the ash. Not in mourning, but in purification. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. This was doctrine. Every act, from the crushing boards to the silence of grief, was part of a belief system older than any written law. A system that told you to shape is to save, to hurt is to honour, and to die in the process is not a tragedy. It is a cleansing. And then came the artists. Yes, artists. Hunnic's skulls weren't just shaped. They were sometimes decorated, carvings etched into the bone, sometimes while the child still lived. Ink and ash rubbed into small grooves along the forehead, creating swirling patterns or clan symbols. These were visible beneath the skin, faintly raised, like scars telling secrets. And when those warriors grew and shaved their heads, the designs became visible, a map of identity, formed not in ink, but in agony. One warrior was known for a spiral cut into his forehead during childhood, which, by adulthood, looked like a vortex above his brow. He claimed it helped him hear the gods during battle. Whether it did or didn't, no one argued, especially not the ones he cut down. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. Some skulls were even cut open deliberately, after shaping. Ritual trepanation, not to relieve pressure, not to heal, but to let the spirits breathe. Small holes were drilled or gouged into the back of the skull, while the child was held down by multiple adults. No anaesthetic, no mercy. And if they survived, they were said to be seers, chosen, touched by the step winds themselves. But let's not pretend this was some ethereal honour. These children weren't swaddled in sacred garb and praised like oracles. They were feared, watched, sometimes avoided, because if the gods could touch your brain, they could also twist it. And no one, not even a hardened Hun mother, wanted a child who stared at fires and whispered prophecies with blood crusted in their ears. One boy, known only as Irdek, survived a trepanation at age 6. The cut had gone deep. Too deep, the elders said, but he didn't die. He screamed for 2 nights straight, then fell into a trance for 3 days. When he woke, he wasn't the same. He refused to speak, refused to eat unless the food was placed directly in his left hand. He would walk in circles during storms, eyes fixed skyward, muttering in broken tongues. But here's the part that made him infamous. Before every major raid, Irdek would take a charred bone, trace lines into the dirt, and whisper who would die. Not vague guesses, names. And he was right. After his 3rd correct prophecy, mothers started bringing their children to him, just to touch his hand. Not out of love, out of desperation. If even a fragment of his madness could be passed on, maybe their children would survive the coming bloodbath. Irdek died at 15. His skull, complete with the carved hole, was passed from war chief to war chief, like a compass made of pain. But that wasn't even the worst part. It became fashionable, if that word even applies, to trepanate elite children. Only once the skull shaping was complete, of course. And only if the child had proven themselves worthy through ritual combat. The idea was to amplify what was already there: strength, vision, divine favour. A hole in the head became a status symbol, a literal opening for destiny. The deeper the cut, the closer you were said to be to the gods. One warlord drilled 2 holes. He died foaming at the mouth mid-feast. No one wept. Meanwhile, the Roman world watched in horror and awe, because no matter how savage they called the Huns, they couldn't ignore the results. Huns didn't just win battles, they overwhelmed, destabilised, infected order with chaos. Their children, shaped from the womb, didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. And it wasn't because they were mindless, it was because fear had been scraped out of them at birth and replaced with something colder. Let's go back a bit, to the act itself, the shaping. We've talked about the boards, the bindings, the screams, but what's rarely mentioned is the sound. Not the crying, the creaking, the wet, grinding creak of bone shifting under pressure. Mothers would hum to drown it out, but it was always there, just beneath the lullaby, a damp, intimate sound, like ice cracking, like something sacred breaking just enough to be useful. Some midwives claimed they could feel the skull decide, that moment when the bone gave up its roundness, surrendered to the form. And after that, the baby didn't cry the same way. The pitch changed, higher, thinner, like the scream had been shaped too. And mothers, weary, red-eyed, breathing through clenched teeth, took that as a sign. The ritual was working. Their baby was becoming less child, more weapon. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, certain clans started keeping the shaping boards. Most were discarded after use, burned or buried. But a few were saved, polished, decorated, passed down like heirlooms. These weren't tools, these were relics. Some even gained names like Jawbreaker or Star Shaper. They believed the spirit of every child who'd screamed into that wood lingered in the grain. That shaping your child with a board that had already birthed warriors guaranteed victory. One infamous piece, known as Blood Sleep, was used for 3 generations. The last child it shaped was said to have never spoken a word, but could hear horse hooves 3 miles away. That's what they whispered. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. In Hunnic lore, truth bowed to belief. If enough people feared something, it became real. And in a world shaped by screams and sinew, fear was just another tool in the arsenal. Sharp, deliberate, and always earned. That boy, the mute with the predator's hearing, didn't grow up to be a warlord. He became something stranger, a tracker. He never rode with the main horde, but he always rode ahead. Always alone. His head, they said, pointed like an arrow to whatever would die next. But shaping didn't stop with the skull. That was just the beginning. Hunnic mothers weren't content with altering bones. They turned their children's bodies into battlegrounds of transformation. Hands were toughened by forced submersion into boiling mare's milk mixed with ash. Skin was scrubbed raw daily with salt and horsehair to wake the blood. Limbs were pulled, twisted, extended through crude braces to maximize reach for archery. Childhood was not protected. It was prepared, dissected, sharpened. Some infants were even deprived of light during shaping. Tents sealed tight, days spent in flickering shadow. The belief, darkness would sharpen inner sight. It would birth warriors who could kill before dawn, before recognition. One girl, her name lost to time, was raised in total darkness for her first 2 years. She emerged pale, owl-eyed, with a permanent squint. They called her Ghost Child. She never missed a shot. But that wasn't even the worst part. The most terrifying aspect of all this was how ordinary it became. Rituals that, to outsiders, seemed like madness were just background noise in Hunnic life. A baby screaming in the morning, nothing unusual. A toddler vomiting up a swallowed bone shard, just part of breakfast. A child dragged by the ankles to a trepanation pit, while the camp dogs barked, normal, expected. Every Hunnic adult had endured some variation of it, and because of that, no one questioned it. Survival had become sacred, but the scars ran deeper than the skin. What do you think happens to a mind shaped by pain before language, to a heart trained to see affection in pressure, in tightening straps, in ceremonial silence? You grow up mistaking agony for love. And when you become a parent, you repeat the ritual. Not out of cruelty, out of inherited devotion, out of fear that if you don't continue it, your child will be weak, will be prey, will be forgotten. Let's go back a bit, to the first time a child asked why. One account survives in the form of a chant, translated from an old Hunnic dialect. It describes a young boy, no older than 5, who pulled off his binding straps and cried, "Why must my head be a weapon?" His mother didn't scold him. She knelt, pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "Because your soul already is." Then she retied the straps, tighter this time. That boy grew into a commander. Died in his 30s, skull still intact, skull still venerated. The chant ends with this line: "She pressed him into wood, and he pressed through the world." And just when it couldn't get more absurd, Hunnic elites began shaping their children before birth. Not the skull, obviously, but the mind, the expectations. Pregnant women were isolated for the last month, fed only horse blood and fermented mare's milk, made to listen to war songs daily. Some believed it tuned the unborn to battle. One highborn woman refused to sleep on her side, fearing the baby's head would settle unevenly. She gave birth to twins. One died, the other became known as the Arrow, fastest cavalryman in his clan. Dead at 19, lungs pierced by a spear, but until that moment, he was legend. Even in death, the shaped were special. Their skulls were extracted, cleaned, and offered to the gods. Some were buried beneath thresholds, so the dead could guard the living. Others were hung from trees as warnings, and a few, just a few, were shattered with hammers, so their spirit could never be captured, never controlled, never mocked by enemies. Because in Hunnic logic, even death was strategic. The body was disposable, but the skull, that sculpted relic of pain and identity, was dangerous in the wrong hands. Roman commanders once paid double for the heads of slain Hun warriors, not for science or superstition, but for display. To mount the enemy's skull was to claim their power, so the Huns, in return, learned to destroy what they could not protect. And this practice of post-mortem smashing wasn't just vengeance, it was prevention. Skulls were sacred, yes, but only when they stayed within the tribe. Once exposed to outsiders, they became vulnerable, polluted, misread. The idea that a Roman priest might bless a Hunnic skull, that a Greek surgeon might cut it open for study, unthinkable. So they shattered them, sometimes in the middle of the battlefield, blood still steaming on the grass, but that wasn't even the worst part. Sometimes the Huns shattered living skulls, not out of rage, not out of punishment, out of ritual. If a child was found to be weak-willed, even after shaping, screaming, surviving, they might be chosen for unmaking. It wasn't common, but it happened, a reverse rite, designed not to destroy the child, but to release the tribe from the shame of their failure. The child would be paraded in silence, his skull covered by black cloth, then taken beyond the camp's edge, and undone. Witnesses rarely spoke of these events, not because they were taboo, but because they were terrifyingly normal. One soldier described it simply, "He was soft inside, so we let the sky in." That's what they called it, letting the sky in. Let's go back a bit, to the fires at night, to the glow behind leather tent flaps, the smoke curling up from cooking pits, the low hum of horse songs, and sharpened bone flutes. This was when stories were told, not fairy tales, not myths, histories, and every history began the same way. The pain came first, not the name, not the place. The pain. Children sat quietly, cradling their shaped skulls between bruised hands, listening to tales of how their ancestors bled, screamed, fought, died, and rose again in memory. One story tells of a girl named Elura, whose skull had been shaped so sharply that her forehead developed a natural ridge, like the prow of a ship. She was mocked even by other Huns, until the day she led a raid across a frozen river, and her skull split the ice like a blade. 10 enemies drowned. She earned a new name that day, Icebreaker. Her mother, upon hearing of the victory, didn't cry. She simply nodded and sang the shaping song again, alone by the fire, as if reminding the air that her pain had not been wasted. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, some mothers began choosing to shape their unborn children's names based on the intended outcome of the skull. A child meant to be a scout might be named Thinwind. One meant to be a rider, Spine Straight. But it wasn't poetic, it was programming. These names were chosen before the child even opened its eyes, then echoed during shaping. Spine Straight, whispered between tightening straps, the name embedded in the bone. There were even cases where names were changed mid-shaping, when the skull resisted, when the child's scream faltered, when the ridge didn't form quite right. A boy meant to be bone-cut became slackjaw. His future changed, his placement changed. One slip in symmetry, and the name fell like a blade. Identity, in Hunnic culture, wasn't assigned. It was forged, and if the mould cracked, so did the name. But here's the final gut punch for this part. These practices didn't fade after childhood. Adult warriors sometimes reshaped their skulls voluntarily, a second binding, a recarving, an act of spiritual reset. Maybe they'd failed in battle, maybe they lost a duel, maybe they simply felt unworthy, and so they returned to the boards, to the fire, to the silent dawns. Not to remember who they were, but to become someone else entirely. Imagine that. A grown man, scarred from years of war, setting down his sword and voluntarily placing his skull back into a wooden vice, not as punishment, not as ritual, but as redemption, as if the shape of his head could erase the shape of his failures. In Hunnic thought, identity wasn't just fluid, it was malleable, compressible, bone deep. This practice, known as the second shaping, was kept secret. It wasn't done in public. It was whispered about in low tones, like a curse or a confession. Men would disappear from their units, vanish into the healers' tents or into the woods, and return weeks later with shaved heads, raw foreheads, bandaged brows, and silence. No one asked, no one mocked, because everyone knew, if you were willing to break your skull again, you were either completely lost or dangerously reborn. Some warriors claimed it gave them clarity, that the pain opened a door in the mind, that they heard things in the pressure, the ancestors, the wind, the truth. Others came back changed in more terrifying ways, colder, less human. One returned with a gaze so blank, his own mother refused to speak to him. "He walks like a man," she said, "but he left his name in the wood." But that wasn't even the worst part. The practice started to spread. Other tribes began adopting it, not out of reverence, but out of fear. If the Huns could reshape their warriors twice, maybe the gods favoured repetition. Clans began pressuring veterans into second shaping, even without failure. It became a rite of prestige, something to prove you hadn't gone soft. One chief reshaped himself 3 times before dying of infection. His final words, as recorded by a scribe who couldn't stop shaking, were, "My thoughts are straight now." Let's go back a bit to the shaping songs. These weren't just sounds to drown the screaming, they were coded language, passed from mother to daughter, generation to generation. Each note corresponded to a pressure rhythm. Fast songs for stubborn skulls, slow chants for swelling heads. Some had specific verses for shaping the back of the cranium to a desired slope, or for softening the temples without causing collapse. It was music as manipulation, a symphony of suffering, calibrated down to the syllable. One recovered fragment translates roughly as, "Bone is not birth, it is a promise. Twist the child and twist the world." That's not poetry, that's policy. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, an entire cast of skull readers emerged. Elders trained specifically to interpret skulls like maps, not just to confirm successful shaping, but to divine futures. They read ridges like runes. A slight bulge near the crown might mean early death. A tapering forehead hinted at betrayal. Mothers consulted them before marriages. Warlords brought newborns to them within hours of birth. One skull reader, famed for never being wrong, was later found dead with her own skull shattered. A likely punishment for what she didn't say in time. And here's where the line between science and sorcery completely blurred. Some Huns believed that shaped skulls could think differently, that the angle of the bone affected moral judgment, reflex speed, even dreams. It wasn't superstition. It was survival logic disguised as destiny. If you lived longer with a sharper brow, then sharp brows became holy, and soon skull shape defined more than status. It defined truth. Children with unusually shaped heads were sometimes sent to serve as emissaries, not because they were skilled in speech, but because their skulls were so intimidating that Roman officials often refused eye contact. One Roman diplomat reportedly wrote, "Their foreheads jut like cliffs, and I fear even their thoughts would kill." And somewhere, back at camp, a mother heard that, smiled, and whispered to herself. 3 syllables soaked in blood, bone, and pride. It wasn't a declaration, it was a verdict, and behind every shaped skull that returned from battle, from negotiation, from exile, there was a mother waiting in the shadows, whispering that phrase like a spell she'd been casting since sunrise, because if the scream at dawn was the incantation, the shaped skull was the charm. The charm that kept death a step away, until it didn't. But something darker was coming. The rituals that once bound the tribe together began to fray. The more successful the Huns became, the more they fragmented. Different clans started experimenting with rival techniques, competing pressures, alternate tools, divergent philosophies. Some favoured tall, towering skulls. Others preferred wide, brutal domes. A few heretical groups began shaping only one side of the skull, claiming it created asymmetrical minds, better for chaos in war. The results? Nightmarish. Children who couldn't stand straight, warriors who heard whispers that weren't there. One such warrior, named Terug, became infamous. His left eye twitched constantly, his walk leaned sideways, but in battle he fought like a storm possessed. They said he didn't dodge blades, he leaned into them. His asymmetrical skull was seen as a gift until he killed his own chieftain in his sleep, mistaking him for an enemy in a dream. They didn't execute him. They fed him poisoned wine and told him he was ascending. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, a small sect within the Huns began using metal shaping frames instead of wood, iron and bronze, bent with fire and clamps. The pressure was tighter, the process quicker, but the results more brutal. Some children didn't survive even a day in these cages. Their foreheads caved, eyes bulged, spines twisted, but those who did survive were held up as gods. Not chosen by spirits, but forged by man. One frame was recovered centuries later, rusted, warped, still stained dark in places. A museum called it an artifact of coercion. But to a Hun mother, it would have been a cradle, a forge, a prayer answered in metal. Let's go back a bit, to the act of birth itself. Hunnic midwives weren't gentle. The moment the child crowned, the ritual began. Before the umbilical cord was cut, the skull was measured by hand. Not with tools, with instinct. Feel the softness, read the shape, they would say. If the fontanelle pulsed too fast, it was a bad omen. If the crown felt too narrow, it was said the child would never lead. Some were shaped immediately, others were set aside. Watched, the word was, not loved, not named. Watched, as if the wrong kind of skull might fix itself before morning. It rarely did. And those first hours, that's when the songs began. A mother's voice, dry with labour, still slick with blood, humming as the frame was strapped. No tears, no fear, just melody, the melody of becoming. And outside, the rest of the camp pretended not to hear. But that wasn't even the worst part. The shaping didn't always succeed. Some skulls cracked, others resisted, rebounded, warped back into partial curves like half-melted wax. These children were called echo heads, a cruel term, suggesting they could never hold true thoughts, only reflect the world around them. Echo heads weren't discarded, they were used, sent as bait in ambushes, sent to wander into enemy camps with knives tied to their palms. A few even exploded into violence, incapable of speech but fluent in rage. One girl was said to have killed an entire patrol with a sharpened jawbone and no armour. She died in the mud. Her mother was later seen laughing alone by the fire, because for some Hunnic women, the scream wasn't the end. It was just the first note in a song that never stopped. Every night, the wind carried it, howls of shaped children, war-birthed, fate-tied, and every night, someone new was listening. Not just the wolves pacing outside the firelight, not just the wind curling through broken helmets and twisted branches, but rival tribes, curious spies, future enemies. They heard the songs, they saw the skulls, and they wanted in, because somewhere, twisted inside that horror, was envy. The Huns weren't just feared, they were believed. No one doubted their will. No one mistook their cruelty for chaos. Every scream had a purpose. Every scar meant survival. And every child was a sermon carved into flesh. That's when the copying started. At first it was crude. Other nomads tried to replicate the skull shaping with their own materials. Rope, cloth, even stone weights. But it failed. The screams came, but the results didn't. Because shaping wasn't just technique. It was doctrine. It was timing. It was obsession. Without the midnight songs, the birth measurements, the sacred ash, all they were doing was torturing infants without reason. And the Huns knew it. They laughed at the imitators. Until they didn't, because one tribe, the Kutrigers, got close. Too close. They began abducting Hunnic midwives, interrogating them, forcing them to reveal the secrets behind shaping symmetry. Some gave in, some died under questioning. One was said to have swallowed a hot coal rather than explain the binding rhythm of the 3-day turn. But the damage was done. Kutriger children started appearing with shaped skulls. Not as elegant, not as sharp, but real. The Huns retaliated the only way they knew how. Let's go back a bit, to the night of the burned cradle. A Kutriger camp, deep in the western steppe, was attacked under full moonlight. No warning, no survivors, except one, a baby. The story goes that Hunnic warriors entered the camp, found a newborn mid-shaping, and stopped, not to spare it, to watch, to see what they'd copied. Then silently, they left the child wrapped in its bindings, alive, and burned everything else. Tents, horses, people, all ash. They left one message scrawled in horseblood across the ground. Shape your own. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, some Hunnic mothers began disfiguring their own infants on purpose. Not for beauty, not for power, but for deception. In times of war, when scouts were taken prisoner, or children were left behind in conquered settlements, a smooth skull meant death, so mothers would twist the boards awkwardly, apply heat to the frames, deform the symmetry just enough to make the child look unshaped. Survivors? Pretenders? It was the ultimate betrayal of everything they stood for, and the ultimate sacrifice. One such child, later known as Karek, was raised in a Roman monastery after being found near a burned-out camp. His skull looked untouched, but when Roman surgeons examined him, they found microfractures, calcified indentations, signs of intense early trauma. He grew up speaking Latin, quoting scripture, serving the church, but at 30, he vanished. A year later, Roman caravans were raided along the Danube. Witnesses described a war leader with Latin prayer tattoos and a Roman accent, whose helmet, when removed, revealed a scarred, twisted skull that still bore the mark of wooden bindings. And the worst part, he thanked his mother for it. But something darker was coming. Within the Hun tribes themselves, the shaping began to evolve into superstition-fueled madness. Not every child could meet the standards. Not every skull was perfect, but rather than accept variants, some elders began to label imperfect skulls as cursed. They believed a malformed forehead meant divine punishment, or even treachery in the bloodline. Accusations flew. Mothers were blamed. Some were banished, a few were executed. One mother, accused of birthing 3 crooked skulls in a row, was tied to a wooden frame and left to die under her own shaping board. She did not scream. She sang all night. The next morning her children, still alive, disappeared into the mountains. Decades later, a band of mercenaries returned with identical skulls. Wide, unbreakable, misaligned, but unmistakably Hunnic. Their foreheads didn't angle like blades. Their skulls weren't as tall or symmetrical, but the air around them, thick, charged, deliberate, was familiar. They rode like ghosts through the borderlands. No tribe claimed them, no banner marked them, but the scars on their brows, the old grooves in their foreheads, the fractured bone healed at violent angles. That was heritage. That was a hymn sung through deformity, because what made a Hun wasn't symmetry, it was pain remembered. These outcasts began calling themselves the Fractured, a cruel joke maybe, or maybe an anthem. They didn't try to correct the shaping, they didn't rebuild the ritual, they weaponized the failure, wore it like armor. If the perfect Huns thought bone had to be shaped to matter, then the Fractured were proof that even broken bone could still kill. But that wasn't even the worst part. Some elders started fearing them, not because they were heretics, because they were free. The Fractured didn't follow shaping codes, didn't chant shaping songs, didn't hold sacred the boards and bindings and blood-soaked frames. They believed pain alone made them real, and in that rejection, they found clarity. Some even began recruiting damaged warriors, men and women whose skulls were ruined by war, illness, failed rituals. They welcomed them, gave them names, carved new paths into old bone. One woman whose skull had collapsed in infancy and grown lopsided became their spiritual leader. She was blind in one eye, twisted in spine, and walked with a limp. But when she spoke, even the hawks on the cliff stopped circling. She taught that the gods had no interest in symmetry, that the wind blew through cracks, not across perfect surfaces. Her name was lost, her title remained, Mother Ruin. Let's go back a bit, to the first fracture, the literal one, a shaping gone wrong, long before the Fractured had a name. A midwife forgot the correct tension. The child's skull split, clean down the left temple. He survived, grew up quiet, but when his camp was raided by Slavic mercenaries, he killed 6 men before they could reach the horses. No sword, no training, just fury. His skull, though cracked, had calcified like armour. They say the blade meant to cleave his face snapped on impact. He lived to old age, died laughing, requested that his skull be left unburned. "Let the crows shape me next," he said. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, there were rumours, unverified but persistent, that some Fractured began shaping themselves as adults, not second shaping, self-shaping, alone, with stones, clamps or carved wood. They didn't chant, they didn't measure, they pressed and pressed and pressed, sometimes for days until the forehead shifted, sometimes inward, sometimes upward, always with damage. They said it let the old pain out. One man carved spirals into his skull using nothing but flint. When asked why, he whispered, "So they'll stop dreaming through me." Because here's what no one likes to admit. The shaped skulls didn't just carry legacy, they held memory. The belief was that the pain of the shaping locked into the bone, and that under certain moons or through certain dreams, the pain could echo back, like a song stuck in the marrow. Mothers said they could still hear their children's birth screams at night. Fathers claimed their dead sons called to them through pressure changes in their foreheads. But something darker was coming. Some Fractured began collecting skulls, not trophies, relics, only broken ones, ones discarded by other clans, tossed into rivers, buried in shallow graves. They dug them up, cleaned them, marked them with soot symbols, and placed them in what they called the Whispering Wall, a line of fractured skulls mounted on wooden poles facing east, not to be worshipped, to be heard, because they believed fractured bone didn't silence pain. It released it, as if the fracture opened a passageway between memory and marrow, as if the old screams weren't gone, just buried, and all it took was one jagged crack to let them rise again. That was the philosophy of the fractured. Pain wasn't a prison, it was a prophecy. And if shaped skulls were museums of control, then fractured ones were bonfires of rage. Chaos, yes, but purposeful chaos. The kind that made kings look over their shoulders and generals rethink their maps. The whispering wall grew. What began as a line of salvaged skulls became a circle, then a spiral. Each pole bore a name etched in soot. Not the real names of the dead, but names given after death, half howl. Bent truth, jaw torch, every name was a confession, a scream reborn. And on certain nights, when the wind whipped through the valley and the fire cracked just right, the Huns said you could hear the wall whisper back, but that wasn't even the worst part. The fractured began sending envoys, not warriors, children, skull-shaped, bone-marked, but with eyes so steady it unnerved even seasoned warlords. These children would walk into Hunnic camps and simply sit by the fire. Say nothing, eat nothing, and just stare. No threats, no gifts, just presence, a silent, bone-deep reminder that even perfection could be broken and still return. One of these children, nicknamed Driftskull, sat in the centre of a major war council for 5 days without uttering a word. On the 6th day, she pointed at a general and said, "You have 1 season left." He died exactly 4 moons later. Horse bucked, neck snapped, no battle, no glory, just prophecy fulfilled. No one laughed at the fractured after that. Let's go back a bit. To the roots of shaping, before the glory, before the ritual. In the oldest stories, shaping wasn't aesthetic, it was practical. Early Huns believed that a narrow skull made for faster reflexes in the saddle, that a ridged brow deflected glancing blows, that a sloped cranium aligned better with the wind when riding. It was physics mistaken for faith. They thought they were engineering survival, not crafting destiny. But somewhere along the way, utility gave birth to theology, and when pain works, people stop asking why. By the time of Attila, the ritual had become so widespread, so sacred, that even not shaping your child was viewed as treasonous. One commander exiled his brother for refusing to bind his daughter's head. "If her skull is free," he said, "her loyalty will be too." That girl grew up in the foothills, married a shepherd, and never returned. Her name was scratched off every record, as if smooth bone erased bloodline, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, some elite warriors began reshaping others. In a brutal twist on the original rite, captured enemies, especially Roman scouts or rival tribal leaders, were strapped into makeshift frames and forcibly reshaped as humiliation. The process was never completed, just enough pressure to deform, to crack, to warp. They were then released with their skulls half crushed, memories scrambled, balance destroyed. It wasn't just torture, it was psychological warfare. The message was clear: we can remake you in our image, or ruin you trying. One Roman courier, returned in this state, reportedly crawled the last 2 miles home on all fours, speaking only in Hunnic curses. He died a week later, but not before carving into the barrack wall the phrase, "They ride inside my head now." But something darker was coming: internal fractures, literal and symbolic. As the power of the fractured rose, younger Huns began questioning the old shaping rituals altogether. Was symmetry really strength, or just tradition, pretending to be truth? Some began reshaping their boards, making them uneven, curved, experimental. Others abandoned binding entirely, choosing to shape through combat instead. Headbutting stone, riding without helmets, fasting in fire pits until the skull found its edge. It was no longer about identity, it was about escalation, and once pain becomes a contest, there's no bottom to the pit. The shaped heads got taller, the pressure tighter, the tools crueler. It wasn't enough to mark the bone anymore. They wanted to brand it. Some began inserting hot pebbles between bindings to wake the spirit. Others carved runes into still soft foreheads, believing that when the bone hardened, the mark would seal into the skull like a divine contract. Spoiler, it did. And sometimes the infection sealed in too. One young warrior, obsessed with the spiral rune for endless vision, etched it into his temple with a bone needle and ink made from burnt marrow. When the wound closed, he claimed he could see into people's thoughts. No one believed him, until he told a chieftain's wife her husband was hiding a second family across the river. 3 days later, the chieftain was dead, and the warrior, who'd renamed himself Mindmark, was promoted. But that wasn't even the worst part. Children began to request their own shaping. Not just tolerate it, request it. Some begged for earlier binding, harder angles, longer sessions. Pain was no longer inherited, it was earned. One girl fasted for 6 days before allowing her skull to be wrapped, convinced that hunger would soften the will. When her shaping was complete, her forehead curved like a crescent blade. She was 10. They called her Moon Cut. And the mothers, they were proud, because in this new age, love was measured in resilience, in pressure, in silence through agony. A crying child was a failure, a silent one. Now that was a daughter of the steppe. Let's go back a bit to the ritual of mirror smashing. Around the time this escalation peaked, shaped youths were encouraged to destroy all reflective surfaces after their shaping completed. Not out of vanity, but the opposite. They believed looking upon one's shaped face too soon trapped the ego in the bone. That vanity dulled instinct. So mirrors, polished metal, even clear water pools were shattered or avoided. One account describes a boy who accidentally glimpsed his reflection and refused to speak for a week. When he finally did, his first words were, "I wasn't supposed to see it yet." He was later blindfolded for a year, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, a fringe group among the fractured began experimenting with reversed shaping, pressing the skull inward rather than outward. Using concave frames, they'd hollow the crown slightly, creating a natural dip in the head. Why? They believed it caught moonlight better. Seriously, they'd sit in the fields at night, heads tilted to the sky, trying to absorb sky memory. One even claimed he dreamt in languages he didn't know. A Latin-speaking scout reported hearing one whisper in perfect Gothic during sleep. When confronted, the man simply said, "The stars have tongues." But something darker was coming, because the violence wasn't staying on the steppe. Shaped warriors were pushing into Europe, into Rome's bleeding edges, and the stories travelled with them, whispers of children born in bone traps, of men whose heads struck fear before their weapons did. One Roman bishop, after witnessing a Hunnic cavalry raid, reportedly fell to his knees, not from faith, but from horror. "Their faces," he wrote, "look as if God pinched them in the womb for punishment." Back in the camps, this was celebrated. The more monstrous they seemed, the safer their children were. Fear was a shield, distortion, a defence, and skulls, those bony altars of devotion, were now geopolitical weapons. A shaped child wasn't just a warrior in training, they were propaganda, biological terror, bone-born diplomacy. And somewhere deep in the highlands, the original midwives watched the fire crackle and whispered the first shaping chant again. Not for ceremony, for mourning, because that's what it had become, hadn't it? Not a tradition, not a rite, but a funeral in slow motion. Every scream, every splinter of wood pressing into newborn skin, every mother's steady hands trembling under the pressure. They were songs for the dead. Not yet buried, not yet bled, but lost just the same. Lost to an idea of beauty that started in survival and metastasized into madness. The midwives had once shaped to protect. Now they shaped to compete, and the children, twisted from the moment they took breath, carried that madness into every step. One mother, after losing her third son in battle, whispered as she reshaped her newborn skull, "At least this one won't die unmarked." She didn't cry, she didn't pause. Her hands moved like they were churning butter, not reshaping a mind, but that wasn't even the worst part. The framing tools had evolved into symbols of power. Chiefs wore miniature versions on necklaces. Elders blessed their edges with blood. In one camp, an entire altar was built out of discarded shaping boards, warped, cracked, stained, and still revered. They called it the Shrine of the First Form. Women would leave locks of their children's hair on it. Men would spit on it before battle. No one touched it after sundown. Let's go back a bit to the concept of the shape within. This was an idea passed quietly between certain clans, that the skull's form wasn't just physical, but spiritual, that even unborn children had a destined geometry, and if the shape pressed upon them in just the right way, they would unlock what was already inside. Visions, instincts, second sight. One story tells of a boy whose forehead was shaped into a precise peak. At age 8, he predicted a lightning strike to the exact tree. At age 12, he predicted a betrayal. His own uncle, who mysteriously vanished before nightfall, the boy grew into a seer, not because of the skull they claimed, but because the skull allowed his spirit to breathe, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, some began shaping objects, bones of animals, skulls of the dead, even rocks. One clan shaped a deer's skull into the same arc as their chief's forehead and mounted it on a spear. They claimed it sang in the wind. Another buried shaped stones under their tents to align their sleep. Madness, or maybe the logical endpoint of too much belief in bone. There were also whisperings of skull pairings, a form of matchmaking based on cranial curvature. Midwives would examine young children's heads and declare future unions. His ridge matches her slope. Their foreheads fold into one fate. It wasn't romantic, it was architectural. One couple, denied permission to marry because their skulls clashed, killed themselves at the base of the whispering wall. Their skulls were later placed side by side, but left unbound. A gesture of rebellion or regret, but something darker was coming. The weather changed. A winter longer than any recorded froze the shaping boards in place. Some mothers bound their children and couldn't remove the frame for days. The skin blistered. The bones stiffened too early. Dozens of children died from infection, from locked jaws, from cold-induced seizures, and still the shaping continued. Because what was death, if not a smoother alternative to shame? One child survived with a skull half shifted, half stuck. He grew into a man who wore no helmet. Not because of pride, because nothing fit. They called him Crookhead, and when he was asked why he fought for a tribe that let him suffer like that, he simply said, "Because they still made me." He died laughing, holding the frame that once split his brow, as if pain was not just a memory, but a relic worth clinging to. That wooden ark, stained, splintered, warped by time, was no longer a tool. It was a crucifix, not of salvation, but of suffering. And in the hands of a man called Crookhead, it wasn't a symbol of failure. It was proof of initiation. Proof that he too had passed through the furnace and come out bent, but burning. His death marked something. Not the end of shaping, no, that would take far longer, but the beginning of reflection. Quiet, crawling reflection. Younger warriors began asking questions aloud. Why must the frame bite deeper than the blade? Why must beauty be a bruise that never heals? Why must the gods only hear screams? But that wasn't even the worst part. The elders answered, and they answered with silence. They had no new justifications, no deeper truths to offer. They simply passed down the rituals, as they always had, and watched the children bleed. And if one frame cracked, another was carved. If one infant died, another was born. The cycle didn't stop because no one wanted to be the first to admit it had spun too far. Let's go back a bit, to a story seldom repeated, the tale of the unshaped chief. His real name is lost, maybe buried on purpose, but the bones tell us he was born smooth-headed during a famine when no wood could be spared for frames. His mother wept, not because he was cursed, but because he would never be chosen. Yet he grew tall, broad, unbreakable, and when his village was raided, he stood alone with a staff and killed 3 riders before they could cross the fire pit. They crowned him not for his skull but for his fire, and still he refused shaping, even after becoming chief. "Let my scars be earned, not arranged," he declared. Elders scowled, mothers whispered, children stared too long, but he ruled wisely, fiercely, until one winter he vanished. No blood, no scream, just gone. Some say he left voluntarily. Others believe he was sacrificed, quietly, ritually, by those who could not bear his truth. That bone alone was never destiny, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, a wave of fake shaping began. That's right, fraudulent skulls. Young men, desperate for status but terrified of pain, began shaving their heads and sculpting their skulls with clay before travelling to other tribes. In the low light of a tent, their misshapen domes passed inspection. They told wild stories of reshaping, of third birth agony, of sacred chants known only to mountaintop monks. It worked until the rains came. One impostor was exposed when a chunk of wet clay slipped off mid-ceremony. He was flayed. Slowly, but something darker was coming. Because the border between shaping and punishment had eroded completely. Children who misbehaved, rebound. Teenagers who challenged the elders, reshaped as correction. A boy accused of theft had his skull bound to the side and left that way for weeks. When released, he couldn't walk straight. They called him Whirlhead and made him dance at every feast, laughing as he staggered through the mud. He eventually killed 4 of them with a cooking knife. He didn't run. He offered his skull afterward, placing it on the firewood stack like tribute. The elders burned it, not as forgiveness, as denial. Still the ashes remained. Still the whispers grew. A strange hush began to follow certain children. Those born during storms. Those whose skulls cracked before shaping. Those who smiled through pressure. They weren't revered. They were watched, and some mothers, wise to the shift in wind, began shaping with softer hands. Slower turns, hesitation. Because the screams were getting louder, and not just from the babies, the silence had fractured. The mothers, once stoic vessels of our ancestral command, were beginning to crack from the inside. Some sobbed after the bindings were done, their hands still smeared with sap and ash. Some vomited at the sound of the first whimper, and a few, though they dared not say it aloud, began to wonder what it would feel like to not pass the pain forward, to let a child be round, unbroken, whole. One such woman was Neera. She was no rebel, no heretic, just tired. Her first 2 sons had been shaped like warriors and died like offerings. One trampled under his own panicked horse, the other flayed by a Roman spear that no ridge could deflect. When her third was born, she stared at his soft, perfect crown and didn't reach for the frame. Instead, she wrapped his head in a warm cloth and whispered, "You will ride, but you will choose your path." That act of mercy cost her everything, but that wasn't even the worst part. They didn't punish her directly. That would have been too obvious, too righteous. No, she was exiled. Quietly. Her firewood was never replenished. Her tent fabric wasn't patched. When she brought her son to the chant circle, they turned their backs. And when winter came, they didn't check if her roof held. It didn't. She survived by moving south, away from the snow lines, where the shaping boards were rumoured to be smaller, gentler. She arrived in a camp of strangers and offered no story, only the quiet promise of silence. They accepted her, because even in a world sculpted by pain, there were those who knew when to stop chiselling. Let's go back a bit, to the first rebellion. Not a war, a gesture. An unnamed mother, centuries earlier, during a solar eclipse, refused to bind her child's head on the 7th day. It was tradition. Bind on dawn 7, chant on dawn 8, seal the shape on dawn 9. But during the eclipse, she whispered, "The skies round today, let him match." Her boy grew up quiet, but wise. Not a warrior, a weaver, but his patterns, strung from horsehair and leather, told stories others forgot. Some say his shapes were copied into battle banners. Others say his bloodline vanished. Both may be true, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, a rumour spread of a hidden valley, the Hollow, where unshaped children were taken, not to be punished, to be protected. No frames, no chants, just open sky and wandering goats. The fractured claimed it was real. The elders denied it, but every few seasons a shaped mother would vanish with her child, and no bones were ever found. Some said the wind that blew from the east carried lullabies. instead of screams. No one ever dared follow, but something darker was coming. Because absence breeds paranoia, and the fewer children screamed at dawn, the more loudly the elders chanted. They held shape festivals, parades of skulls, public measuring contests, mock duels between bent minds and true forms. It was pathetic, a religion gasping on its own incense. One elder even proposed a rebinding of adults whose heads had grown too smooth with age. He called it devotion renewal. It failed. Several died of seizures. One broke his neck trying to sleep in the binding, but the elder was unmoved. Better to die in the grip than live without form, he said. He was later found drowned in a pond. His own reflection shattered with a stone. And still the shaping continued. Not because they believed, but because they feared stopping. Because if the children stopped screaming, what would that silence reveal? One boy, unshaped, walked into a council circle uninvited. Said nothing, just stood there. His forehead was smooth, his eyes calm, and one by one the elders looked away. Not out of shame, no, not yet, but something colder. Recognition, a flicker of memory in their tired bones. That smooth skull didn't represent rebellion, it represented truth, a truth they had buried under centuries of ash and wood and ritual, the truth that the world never asked for shaped heads, they did, that they weren't responding to the gods, they were creating them, one press at a time. The boy left without a word. No chance followed, no punishment came, just an eerie stillness, as if the air itself wasn't sure whether to scream or exhale. Later, some would whisper he was a ghost, others that he was the last son of the unshaped chief, but the most dangerous theory, that he was just a boy. Nothing more, nothing less, and that was what terrified them most. But that wasn't even the worst part, because the younger mothers had seen him too, and they remembered the silence, how complete it was, how human. They began to look at their own children differently, not as projects, not as monuments, but as people. For a people raised on agony, that shift was heresy. Let's go back a bit, to the evolution of the tools. The first shaping boards were crude, scraps of bark, padded with fur. They evolved into carved oak, wrapped in waxed leather. Then came the iron hinges, the screw-tight frames, the precision curves meant to mould, not just skulls but identity. It became art. Then weapon, then liturgy. Some frames were passed down like relics, others were burned with their users. One mother requested her own ashes be mixed into her child's binding cloth. Let him carry me on his brow, she said. The child didn't survive the fever, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, a cult of purifiers rose in the eastern steppes. Their mission, to eliminate all unshaped children from every tribe. They didn't ask permission, they didn't leave notes, they simply arrived at dawn, inspected foreheads, and acted. Their leader, known only as Ridge, was said to have a skull so sharply shaped it could slice fabric. He wore no helmet, he wore a crown of horse teeth wired together. When confronted about murdering a toddler, he reportedly replied, "Bones don't lie, hearts do." He disappeared after the second winter. His crown was found nailed to a tree, but something darker was coming. It wasn't the cults, it wasn't the children, it was the emptiness. Camps were shrinking, fewer infants survived, fewer mothers shaped, the boards sat gathering dust, the fires burned low, and still the elders clung to the past. They chanted louder, held naming rights for skulls that didn't match, bound newborns, already sick, already too small, too soft, and they buried them faster. One midwife, in a final act of mercy, began loosening the bindings after the mothers left, just enough to give the skull room to breathe. She never said a word, just listened. To the breathing, to the living. They called her a traitor, but more mothers began seeking her out. Quietly, after dark, one by one, like moths toward the only fire that didn't burn. A shift was coming, not loud, not bloody, just a slowing, a soft rebellion, a moment where tradition met exhaustion and didn't win. One child, shaped half-heartedly, grew up with a lopsided head and a sharper tongue. He asked an elder, "If pain makes me strong, "Why are you so weak?" The elder struck him. The boy didn't cry. He simply said, "I'll remember that when it's my turn to shape yours." And the elder did not sleep well that night. Because nightmares have a scent. Not just the rot of forgotten corpses or the mildew clinging to blood-soaked cloth, but something sharper, like regret steeped in sweat. That boy's words echoed louder than a war drum. Not because they were violent, but because they carried the one sound the old ones feared most: future. For generations, they'd convinced themselves that power passed through pressure, that a child's skull shaped just right could carry an empire on its brow. But what if the empire had already collapsed and they were just shaping ruins? But that wasn't even the worst part. The elders began holding night watches, not to protect the camp, but to monitor whispers, conversations, disobedience. Any mother seen hesitating during binding was summoned. Any midwife caught loosening cloth was replaced. Stories of the hollow were banned under threat of exile. One elder even began training dogs to recognize the scent of unshaped infants. Their howls at dawn were meant to warn. But all they did was remind everyone how much was still dying. Let's go back a bit to the Echo Festival. It was once a celebration of shape and sacrifice, held once a year at the winter solstice. Warriors wore masks carved to mimic the ideal skull. Children paraded through bonfires. There were dances, blood rites, chant battles, but the last few years had grown quieter. Fewer masks, less fire. The chants echoed too loudly in the empty spaces. One year, a boy refused to wear his mask, said it smelled like rotten tears. When forced, he bit the leather until it tore and threw it into the sacred flame. It hissed, and so did the elders. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the tribe's lawkeeper began forgetting names. Important ones: the founding mother, the first shaper, the war-twin sons. He'd mix them up, confuse their skulls, contradict their chants. Some blamed age, others whispered of curses. One midwife muttered that maybe the bones were tired of being remembered. Still they made him chant. Still, they bowed when he raised the cracked ceremonial frame, but more and more his hands trembled. Once the frame slipped and struck a child in the face, breaking his nose. They called it an omen, but for what? No one dared guess. But something darker was coming. A winter storm swept through the steppe. Tents collapsed, livestock scattered, fire pits froze, and in the chaos, several shaping frames went missing. At first they thought thieves, then deserters, but then they found the frames, burned, charred, stacked neatly like firewood at the edge of the camp. No bones, no blood, just ash and smoke, and the faint scent of scorched leather. It was a message, and not a subtle one. The youngest among them started wearing hoods, not from shame, but solidarity, unshaped, unmasked, unbent. They met in the forest, beyond the shrines. No chants, just silence. They called themselves the Round Ones, an insult once spit at infants born without shaping, now reclaimed. They didn't preach, they didn't convert, they just existed. And that was enough. One elder confronted them, demanded they kneel, show their skulls, prove they bore the legacy. The youngest girl in the group stepped forward. No older than 9, calm as nightfall, she looked the elder dead in the eye and said, "What good is your shape if your mouth speaks fear?" He struck her. She didn't flinch, just stared. The others moved in, not to fight, just to stand. The elder backed away. He later claimed he saw something in their eyes, not hatred, not defiance, something worse, pity. And pity, when born from the unshaped, is the sharpest cut of all. Not a blade, not a spear, not even a mother's cry in the cold morning air. No, pity was something far worse. It was the reflection of failure without the mercy of forgetting. It told the elders, "We see you, and not in the heroic songs you carved, but in the cracks you pretend are sacred." The cracks are showing, old men, and the children aren't scared anymore. One by one, the fires burned lower. Frames were lost in storms that never happened. Cloth bindings were accidentally cut too short. And when asked about it, the mothers just shrugged. Some began shaping dolls instead, tiny wooden heads warped and tied in ritual, a kind of performance art for a dying age. But not all were pretending. Some still held fast, tightening the cords harder with each passing moon. If the future was leaving them behind, they would carve it deeper into flesh and bone before surrendering. But that wasn't even the worst part. It was working. That violence, that desperation. One mother, enraged after being mocked by her daughter for clinging to old ways, reshaped the child's skull in secret, wrapped her head at night while she slept. The child woke screaming, blood leaking from her ear. She never spoke again, and still, the mother was praised for restoring discipline. Elders began citing her as a return to form. The girl became a silent monument, worshipped. Broken. Let's go back a bit to the sky ceremony. Once a birthright of every shaped warrior, after their skull had fully hardened, they would be raised on a tall wooden platform at dawn and left alone for a full night. Their brow exposed to the open sky, it was meant to bind heaven to bone. Some claimed they saw visions, ancestors, horses of fire, rivers of stars. Others only saw cold and hunger. The ritual was largely symbolic, until the year a boy jumped. He wasn't unshaped, he wasn't weak, his form was perfect, but the silence had gotten inside him. When they found his body, his skull had cracked on a rock, splitting clean down the ridge. The elders wept, not for his death, but for the fracture. It was, they whispered, an insult to geometry. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, a tribe elder declared that only shaped skulls would be buried in the sacred mound. Unshaped children, burned, scattered, forgotten. It was genocide by tradition, but the younger guards, those who once obeyed without question, began delaying the cremations. Some switched the bodies, some built fake pyres, some buried the children themselves in secret groves, marking graves with twisted willow branches. Not for religion, for remembrance. One boy's grave bore a single carved word, enough. But something darker was coming. Because tradition doesn't die quietly. It howls, it claws, it begs to be obeyed, and as more frames disappeared and more children slipped through the bindings, the remaining elders turned to the old way, blood and terror. They resurrected the ritual of the hollow skull, a practice so cruel it had been banned even among war clans. It involved drilling into the forehead of adolescents who disobeyed, supposedly to let the shame out. In truth, it left them fevered, scarred, often blind. The first child chosen was 14, her crime laughing at a chant. She didn't survive the night, but her twin brother did, and he wasn't quiet about it. The next morning, the sacred platform burned. The ceremonial frame was shattered and left at the mouth of the elder's tent. Someone carved into it, not with care, but with fury, the phrase, "You shaped nothing." The smoke from that fire was thick, bitter, laced with the smell of burning hair and defiance, and for the first time in decades, the step was silent. Not from fear, from the weight of realization. That was the moment the spell broke, not with a battle, not with a betrayal, with the sick, sludgy awareness that the thing they had spent centuries sculpting, this religion of pain, this altar of bone, had never truly made them powerful. It had just made them obedient. Shaped skulls didn't birth prophecy, they birthed silence, and silence, it turned out, was a terrible listener. The fire didn't kill anyone, but it killed something. Hope, maybe, or just the illusion of control. The elders emerged from their tents the next day, blinking like cave bats, their chants thin, their bones colder than usual. And the children, they didn't bow, they didn't kneel, they just watched and waited and remembered. But that wasn't even the worst part. The elders tried to reclaim order by invoking the bone prophecies, a series of ancient verses said to predict the rise and fall of the Hunnic people based on the shapes of their skulls. According to one verse, when the heads grow smooth and the eyes refuse the dawn, the bloodline shall collapse into dust. The elders quoted it endlessly, painted it on banners, inscribed it on the back of skull frames, but the children had their own prophecy now. Passed in whispers, never written. When the scream stops, the gods will listen. Let's go back a bit, to the silent season. The first recorded winter, where no new bindings were made, not one. No dawn screams, no shaping fires. The frames stayed tucked away in cloth, and no one asked why. Some said the trees had grown too weak to give good wood. Others said the midwives had cursed the tools, but really, everyone just stopped, as if their hands remembered what their mouths refused to say. This isn't survival anymore. It's just cruelty on repeat, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, a visiting trader from the west arrived with a gift, a curved bronze mirror, beautiful, smooth, undistorted. He claimed it was from a kingdom where skulls were sacred in their natural form, where beauty meant balance, not deformity. The elders refused to look at it, called it poison, said it would warp the spirit. The children passed it around for hours. One girl pressed it to her forehead, let her breath fog the glass and said, "I am whole." Her voice wasn't loud, but it echoed louder than a battlefield. But something darker was coming. Not an invasion, not a curse, just memory, feral and hungry, because for every child who went unshaped, there were 3 who still bore the frame's mark. Still bore the dents, the pain, the trauma in their dreams. One night, a group of shaped teens attacked an unshaped campfire circle, called them traitor spawn, burned their food, carved crude ridges into a tree, laughing. One boy was thrown to the ground and forced into a makeshift frame. His skull was unscarred, but his heart shattered. He left that night, alone, not to flee, but to wander. Word spread. A new kind of wanderer roamed the steppe now. Not a warrior, not a priest, just a witness. Someone who had seen both sides and carried the ache of neither. A living question mark. His name was lost, but his nickname wasn't. They called him the Smooth One. And when he walked into a camp, no one dared look directly at his head. Not because it was monstrous, because it was free. And freedom to a people raised on bone and obedience looked unnatural, frightening even. The Smooth One didn't wear armour, didn't chant, didn't carry weapons. He wore a simple fur cloak and walked with the kind of ease that made warriors itch. Because how could he walk like that, unmarked, unshaped, and still stand taller than men with skulls chiselled like altars? They called him cursed behind his back, claimed his head echoed with demons. But deep down, they knew. The only thing echoing in that unshaped dome was peace, but that wasn't even the worst part. The Smooth One didn't preach, he didn't recruit, he just was, and that presence alone cracked something wide open. Children followed him from one camp to the next. Not for promises, but for quiet. Mothers began unbinding their babies, not because he told them to, but because seeing him made them remember what it meant to be whole. The elders tried to contain it. They outlawed his name, burned his likeness in effigy, one even attempted to ambush him at the edge of the riverbanks. The elder struck, blade raised high, and the Smooth One stepped aside. The elder fell, hit his head on a stone, split his skull right down the sacred ridge. He lived, but the irony stuck deeper than the wound. Let's go back a bit, to the ritual they tried to resurrect, the Bone Sun Rite. It was supposed to reassert elder power, reforge reverence. They gathered 10 of the most perfectly shaped adolescents and placed them in a circle on a sacred hill at high noon, chanting, drums, dust and smoke. Then, as the final verse echoed out, a sudden wind swept through, a dust devil, strong and howling. It knocked 3 of the children to the ground, scattering bone ash and shattering 2 of the ornate frames into splinters. They called it a bad omen. The children called it freedom knocking. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, a new fashion emerged among the youth. Head wraps, but not for shaping, for hiding, a protest in silk and wool. They walked around camp, skulls covered, refusing to display their forms. Elders demanded removal, teens refused. One boy carved "I am not your sculpture" into his own shoulder, not his skull. His shoulder, the pain wasn't the point. The message was, it spread like fire on dry grass, across valleys, between herders. In every smokehouse and shared tent, some elders gave up, some doubled down, Some simply left, wandered off into the blizzard one night. Mumbling chants to the gods of bone and silence, none returned. But something darker was coming. The final fracture, the moment rebellion stopped whispering and began howling. One morning, in a southern camp, all the shaping frames were found stacked in the fire pit, soaked in lamb fat, wrapped in horsehair, lit before dawn. They burned hot, screamed even, the scent of old wood, resin and blood wafted for miles. But the worst part wasn't the fire. It was what they built next, a monument, not of skulls, not of elders, but of names. Every child who died from infection, or seizures, or fracture. Every infant buried with a head crushed before thought. A simple tower of stone, carved not with prayers, but apologies. No elder approached it, one by one, children laid offerings. Dolls with round heads, unshaped sticks, smooth pebbles, and the smooth one stood at the edge of the crowd. He didn't bow, he didn't speak, he just watched. Not like a leader, not like a prophet, like someone who'd seen too many screams rot into silence, like someone who knew that if he spoke now, it would only echo the very control they were trying to bury. The smooth one wasn't there to save them. He was there to remind them. No one else is coming. If they wanted peace, they'd have to carve it themselves, without wood, without bone. And in that silence, something extraordinary happened. The children sat down. In a wide circle around the monument, no chants, no rituals, just breathing, one heartbeat at a time. Mothers joined, then midwives. Even a few former shapers, hands still calloused from decades of compression, lowered themselves to the frost-hardened earth. A new kind of rite was born. Not through agony, but stillness. But that wasn't even the worst part. The elders arrived, late, always late. They stood on the edge of the gathering, draped in their tattered ceremonial hides, holding frames like relics of a forgotten war. Their eyes darted, searching for allies, for fear, for order. None came. They tried speaking. Nothing. One elder raised his frame above his head, like a scepter, and roared, "Who among you is ready to shape this tribe again?" A child stood, maybe 6 years old. Freckles, bare feet. He walked up to the elder, touched the frame, and said, "Is it heavy?" Let's go back a bit. To the origin of the first frame, legend tells of a Hunnic priestess, midwife to warlords, who saw a dying comet scar across the sky and claimed it was a god with a split skull. She carved the first frame to match the stars, believing shaped heads would channel cosmic clarity, but clarity never came, only pain. And over time the stars forgot. Only humans remembered. And they remembered wrong. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, one of the elder's apprentices defected, tore the bindings off his ceremonial robes, and publicly unshaped himself, wearing a padded frame backward in protest. The act left his forehead bruised, his temples swollen. He limped for days, but when asked why he did it, he answered, "To feel what you forced on me." That quote was etched onto the side of the new monument by dawn, but something darker was coming, a sickness. Not the kind from wounds or weather, a quiet fever that spread among the remaining believers. Not a virus, an obsession. They began shaping themselves again. Adults, elders, they lay in tents at night, heads bound so tight their vision blurred. One used metal wires, another braided their hair so tightly it left scars. They said it was renewal. The children called it regression. One child asked, "If you love the shape so much, why are you breaking yourself trying to fit it?" No answer. One elder, delirious from lack of sleep and blood flow, wandered into the river and drowned. Another tried to convert a new mother by offering to shape her child personally. The mother spat in her face. The final fracture came at dawn. The elders approached the monument, wielding sharpened frames like blades. "This blasphemy ends today," one shouted. The crowd didn't move. They simply stood, unarmed, unshaped. And then the smooth one stepped forward. He carried no frame, no blade, only a small round stone. He placed it at the base of the monument. "Your shape didn't save us," he said. "It broke you. Then he walked away. Not a speech, not a war, just a line in the sand. And sometimes that's all it takes. Not a war cry, not a prophecy, not even a grave. Just one quiet moment where someone says, enough, and doesn't flinch when no one follows. That line, drawn with a stone and silence, didn't crack the tribe in two. It revealed the crack that had always been there, a split not between shaped and unshaped, but between fear and freedom. And now it was visible for everyone to see. The elders stood frozen, not from shame, they'd long burned that from their bones, but from confusion, because the tools they used for centuries, fear, ritual, blood, suddenly had no bite. No child wept. No mother bowed. The crowd simply turned away. That's what broke them, not violence, irrelevance, but that wasn't even the worst part. Some of the elders didn't leave. They stayed, lurking at the edges of campfires, whispering to anyone who still had shaped scars, trying to seed doubt. The gods will punish the round, they hissed. The ancestors are watching. But the ancestors had been watching for centuries and done nothing. Not when the bindings crushed, not when the skulls fractured, not when the rivers ran red with infant blood. And now their silence was a verdict. Let's go back a bit. To the Forest of Frames, a grove deep in the north, once sacred, where broken shaping boards were buried like relics, marked with bones. Songs were sung there, warriors meditated under its twisted trees, but the songs faded, and now the forest was quiet. Until one morning smoke rose from it, slow, steady, fragrant with burning lacquer and regret. Children had returned, dug up every frame, made a pyre so high it kissed the branches. One girl danced around it, wearing a crown of round stones. She didn't chant. She laughed, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, a new ritual emerged. Children gathered at dawn, not to be bound, but to paint their foreheads, each design unique. Swirls, dots, suns, some mocked the old shapes, others told stories. One boy painted a cracked frame in red across his brow and walked proudly through the market. A woman gasped, "You're mocking our history." He replied, "No, I'm remembering it properly." But something darker was coming, not from outside, from within. The youngest generation had grown up in the shadows of both tyranny and rebellion, and now they wanted something else. Nothing, no rituals, no leaders, just silence. But silence, like fire, consumes without mercy. They began turning inward, distrusting everyone over 20, burning not just frames, but books, chants, even memory. If it came from bone, they'd say, it dies with bone. Some warned this wasn't healing, it was erasure, but the momentum couldn't be stopped. Even the smooth one was questioned. He was old now, still walked alone. But now, when he entered camps, children didn't follow. They stared. They asked, "Weren't you still part of it? Didn't you come from the Shapers?" His silence, once powerful, now felt evasive. The line he'd drawn in the sand, it had shifted, erased by newer feet that didn't care who drew it. One evening, he returned to the monument, stood before the Tower of Names, placed one final stone, not round, not shaped, just broken, and walked away into the woods. No one followed, no one thanked him, no one remembered his real name, just a whisper. He was the last of the middle ones, the ones who remembered both fire and frost, who carried the rituals in their marrow but questioned their worth, who could still hear the screams at dawn and chose not to echo them. With his passing into the woods, a strange quiet descended, not peace, not finality, just a pause, as if history itself took a breath, unsure which way to break next. In the absence of elders and the retreat of prophets, the camps fractured. Some became sanctuaries, painting children's heads in colours and swirls. Others turned grim, suspicious of any ritual, even new ones. In one village, a boy was beaten for singing a lullaby that mentioned skull. The pendulum had swung too far. Now even memory was dangerous, but that wasn't even the worst part. Whispers of a new doctrine began to spread, one that didn't worship skulls or freedom. It worshipped forgetting, A clean slate, a doctrine that believed history itself was a wound. Their motto, "What we do not speak cannot scar." They banned songs, burned ancestral carvings, told children they were born from sky, not blood. Let's go back a bit. To a mother in a forgotten tent, whispering stories to her child under a fur blanket. She didn't speak of the old rites. She didn't glorify the smooth one. She just told of a girl who once danced around a fire with stones in her hair. The child asked if it was real. She said no, but she smiled when she lied. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, some shaped elders returned. Ragged, weathered, they came not to lead, but to confess. They told stories of children lost, of hands that shook while tightening frames. One offered her broken shaping tools to the new Council of Youth. They burned them with ceremony, but allowed her to stay. She remembered enough to be forgiven, they said. Others weren't so lucky. In some camps, surviving elders were tried by community, not for execution, but for listening. They had to sit, blindfolded, while unshaped children told them what it felt like. Some couldn't bear it. One tried to flee mid-confession and collapsed, sobbing into the dirt. Not one child reached out, but something darker was coming. A fracture among the unshaped. One group wanted to rebuild with memory, another wanted to erase everything. The clash wasn't loud, it was insidious. One day the monument of names was painted over, not defaced, just repurposed, covered in white clay, turned into a sculpture of unity, with no names, no cracks, no stones, just smoothness. The last surviving name was Enough, scratched into the base, barely legible. A girl noticed. She chipped away the clay with her fingernails for hours. Her hands bled. She sat beneath the tower all night, guarding the exposed word. In the morning, she was gone. Only the word remained, and a small pile of red-painted pebbles, and the rumour started spreading again. Of a figure seen walking alone across the ridges, not shaped, not round, just scarred. No name, no tribe, eyes like winter frost, and if you asked him where he came from, he didn't speak. He just pointed to the horizon, as if to say, what's behind us doesn't matter anymore, but the ground still remembered. The wind still whispered through the grasses, where children once screamed at dawn. You can burn the frames, whitewash the monuments, exile the prophets, but the land keeps score. And sometimes all it takes is one crooked sunrise for memory to come roaring back with bloody teeth. The figure, whoever he was, didn't speak, didn't rest, didn't stay. He passed through camps like a shadow, leaving unease in his wake. Some claimed he was the smooth one returned, now twisted by guilt. Others said he was a shapeless ghost, a punishment for forgetting. Children called him the Echo Man, because wherever he walked, old songs returned. Dreams, faces people swore they had buried, but that wasn't even the worst part. The Echo Man wasn't alone. Weeks later, a child appeared in a southern valley, head wrapped in cloth, face painted half black, half white. She carried no name, only a drum, and when she played it wasn't music, it was cadence, the rhythm of feet bound in ritual. The breathless panic of dawn screams, a sound like ancient wood being tightened. Survivors clutched their ears and wept. Not from pain, from recognition. Let's go back a bit, to the shape itself. The elongated skull. It wasn't unique to the Huns. Cultures from Peru to Sudan practiced it, but the Huns made it gospel. They gave it theology, war, and inheritance, a whole civilization suspended on the lie that suffering created superiority. But the truth, a shaped skull held no more wisdom than a stone, and far less mercy. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, a rogue camp, calling themselves the True Ridge, announced their return to shaping. We shape not for gods, they proclaimed, but for unity. They wrapped their infants in cloth again, not out of reverence, but revenge. The world abandoned us, they said. We will shape a new world. Their chants were old, their tools were new, steel frames, padded vises, mechanized cruelty disguised as evolution. But something darker was coming, the unbinding war. It didn't start with weapons, it started with whispers. Camps divided, those who still believed in the need for form, those who believed in the right to forget, and those who insisted on remembering everything, no matter how much it hurt. They didn't fight with spears, they fought with monuments, names erased, graves uncovered, old skulls displayed as proof or shame, depending on the camp. And through it all the Echo Man walked. Some say he planted the seeds of war, others say he was its first victim. One morning, a group of painted children found a body hanging from the tree above the old forest of frames. No note, no name, but carved into his chest with a bone shard was a single sentence. I was born screaming, you just didn't hear it. They buried him with no song, but they left the body unmarked, because even now, in this era of forgetting and fury, there was still one thing no one dared shape: the truth. Funny thing is, it's never clean, never shaped like a monument. It bleeds, it contradicts, it shames. And in the shadow of the unbinding war, truth was treated like a weapon. Some wielded it to wound, others wore it like armour. But no one wanted to sit with it, to feel it, because truth, unlike ritual, doesn't promise purpose. It just reflects pain. The camps became fortresses, not of stone, but of silence. Children no longer laughed around fires. They debated, argued, drew lines in ash. You forgot too much. You remembered the wrong things. You shaped the past in your own image. By now, even babies weren't named. Parents waited until the child proved which side they belonged to. Some kids were still nameless at 10. But that wasn't even the worst part. They started testing skulls again. Not to shape them, but to read them. A new caste of pseudo-healers emerged, claiming they could feel trauma through cranial ridges. They said you could measure grief, map guilt. This one, they'd say, running fingers across a child's head, descends from silence. Another, a ridge of shame, 3 generations at least. Let's go back a bit, to a scroll found half buried near the old ridge temple. It was brittle, scorched, but one passage remained legible. The more perfectly shaped the head, the less it listens, and the less it listens, the more it commands. Scholars debated its meaning for days. Then a girl read it aloud during a tribunal and asked, if shape equals command, does that mean we gave power to the deafest? No one answered, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, a child sculptor, no older than 12, carved a head, not from bone, from ash and wax. Its features were blurred. The skull was warped, not shaped, not broken, just free. He displayed it in the old forest, under a tent stitched from abandoned frames. Some cried, some screamed. One boy smashed it to pieces, but by dusk, 5 more identical heads had been sculpted. But something darker was coming. The trial of the mothers. It began in a northern camp. Quiet, isolated. A group of teens accused the surviving elder women of being the original binders. They dragged them to the river, made them kneel in the icy mud. No weapons, just questions. Did you press wood to bone? Did you silence screams? Some women confessed, others didn't remember. One just whispered, we were told it would make them beautiful. They weren't executed, but they were marked. Red paint smeared across their foreheads, a symbol of legacy and shame. The paint burned, the river froze around their knees, and the smooth-headed ones watched, not with cruelty, with apathy, because by now empathy had become a currency no one could afford. And in the middle of this spiral, this self-devouring snake of blame and forgetting, the monument of names cracked, not from weather, from within. A stone had shifted, collapsed. Some say it was the weight of the paint. Others say it was time finally giving up. But in the rubble, a fragment was found. A single name, carved backward, the smooth one. And beside it, barely scratched into the stone, 4 words. He shaped nothing, everything changed. A paradox etched in stone, too sharp to ignore, because in a world obsessed with form, this was the one truth that couldn't be twisted. The man who refused to mould others reshaped history, not through sermons or violence, but through stillness, through the audacity of doing nothing in a world where every breath had once been sculpted by force. But now that stone was cracked, and when truth fractures, stories rush in to fill the gap. They rewrote his legacy. Some said he was never real, others claimed he was a spy from the West, sent to dismantle the Hunnic code. A few whispered he was a demon sent by the unshaped gods, proof that suffering was a holy right. Children born after the unbinding war didn't know what to believe, so they stopped believing in anything, but that wasn't even the worst part. A new cult rose from the ruins of the monument. They called themselves the Echoless. Their doctrine? Silence is salvation. They spoke in gestures, burned every scroll, claimed even memory was a betrayal. They wore hoods shaped like smooth skulls, pale and polished, with no mouths carved into them. Babies were raised in isolation chambers to prevent imprinting. If they never hear a lie, the Echoless preached, they'll never seek the truth. Let's go back a bit, to a girl with one ear missing, cut off by her own mother to spare her from tribal songs. She grew up among the Echoless, but one night, when the wind howled through a broken chimney, she began to hum. Soft, off-key. No one taught her. It came from somewhere. She was exiled, branded with soot, and left in the forest where the old frames once burned. She didn't die. She started to build. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the sculptors returned. Not children this time. Adults. They shaped heads again, but not human ones. Animals, spirits, myths. Creatures with 5 eyes and no mouths. Hybrids with cracked horns. Some said it was art, others said it was prophecy, but one thing was clear. Shape was back, not to control, but to confront. They called it the Crooked Revival. But something darker was coming. The first execution in decades. A boy caught painting a child's forehead with a spiral. No force, no frame, just a swirl in red clay. A neighbour reported him, claimed he was reviving the binding faith. A tribunal of Echoless judged him in total silence. He never got to speak. They drowned him in the old Ridge River, where blood once flowed from broken babies. The irony was not lost. The child he painted grew up and never touched red again. Never spoke of the boy, but carved spirals into tree bark whenever no one watched, and when she died, the spiral was found inside her skull, etched into the bone, like a whisper that refused to be buried, and the spiral spread onto rocks, onto tents, onto skin. A new movement began, but no one dared name it, because the names had all been stolen, twisted, ruined, and those who shaped without cruelty, they were called ghosts. Because shaping, no matter how gentle, could never be innocent again. And in the distance, where the last horizon met the cracked stone of the monument, children gathered. They didn't chant, they didn't cry. They just touched the rubble and asked, what's worse, being shaped or being forgotten? That's the question that hummed like a plague across the wind-torn valleys, where the Huns once pressed infant skulls at sunrise. It wasn't rhetorical anymore. It was a wound left open too long, festering into myth. Generations had bled trying to answer it, some with bindings, some with silence, most with the weight of not knowing who they were once they put the frames down. And now, with the last stones of the monument scattered like broken teeth across the dirt, the answer was clear. There was no answer, only the echo of the question, getting louder with every year. No one dared speak it aloud, but someone finally did. Not a leader, not a prophet, just a child, maybe 9, no name, hair shaved, eyes like cracked ice. She climbed the ruins one morning, while others still slept, and screamed it into the dawn. We don't want to forget, but we're tired of remembering wrong. Her voice cracked, her knees bled from the climb, and nobody stopped her, because there was nothing left to stop. The Echoless had vanished, swallowed by their own mute doctrine. The spiral carvers drifted into legend, their symbols mistaken for art and painted over. The camps dissolved into nomadic hushes, groups too afraid to gather in numbers, too fragmented to fight. Babies were born without songs, without frames, without names. And the mothers didn't cry at dawn, they just watched the horizon like it owed them something, but that wasn't even the worst part. The children started shaping themselves, not with wood or bone, but with belief, One tribe called themselves the Remembered. They burned pain onto their skin as a rite of passage. Another group, the Hollow Ones, drilled tiny holes behind their ears to release ancestral pressure. Still another carved spiral tattoos into their own skulls and claimed to hear voices through the pain. Pain makes us pure, they whispered. Pain makes us ours. Let's go back a bit, to the very first sunrise in this story. A mother, eyes swollen with grief, holding her baby still while another woman pressed the frame tighter. She said it was love, said it would make the child beautiful, strong, revered, and maybe she believed it. Maybe belief was the only thing she had left. But belief isn't innocence, it's just a softer kind of cruelty. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, a travelling actor stumbled across a half-buried frame in the sand and turned it into a mask. He performed a play called The Shaping, where no one speaks, only screams. It became a sensation. Tour groups reenacted the rituals without context. Children shaped clay heads for fun. Merchants sold replica frames as novelties. History had finally finished its long descent, from tragedy to entertainment. But something darker was coming. You, the listener, the watcher, the one who came here looking for truth, or horror, or curiosity dressed up as empathy, because now you've seen it all. The crushed heads, the cracked monuments, the silent children, the fires, the river, the whisper. He shaped nothing. Everything changed. And you still want a resolution, a final meaning, a bow to wrap this bleeding thing. But history doesn't end like that. History just bruises forward. And maybe, in some future we'll never see, a child will dig up this story and ask, if they knew how much it hurt, why didn't they stop? And maybe no one will answer, because maybe, deep down, we still think beauty is worth the scream. So next time you look in the mirror, ask yourself, are you shaped, or are you just pretending not to be? You've been watching Hushed Historian, where truth whispers through time.